Now here are the blades of the kanna I showed you earlier, and I'd like to go through each of these and show you kind of some things to look for when you buy a blade. Now this is the cheapest one. This is the one that came in the paper box. You can see that the ura here, which is this hollow, is kind of, maybe you can't see, but it's not as well finished. It's kind of rough compared to, say, the Keizaburo, which is a very nice fine finish here. And that's kind of one thing to look for. The higher quality blades will have a nicely finished ura area here, this uraski, which is the hollow, and it should be, I don't know, but if you're kind of slightly experienced, you should be able to tell if it's either machine ground or hand kind of sort of scooped out or filed, scraped. This one looks machine ground to me, so it's probably a slightly lower quality blade. But that's kind of one thing to look for. The kind of main thing I look for in trying to buy a used blade is this name area here, or the mei. I try to find blades, if I'm buying kind of on auctions and stuff, blades which have been cut by hand using either a chisel or something. Usually if the blade has a mei which has been cut by hand, to me it generally means that someone has went to the effort to actually cut this by hand. Obviously it's harder to cut this name than to just get a stamp and just stamp it. So this means to me that someone actually went to that extra extra step to hand cut it. It's not always the case that hand cut blades are good, well performing blades, and it's not always, and vice versa, it's not always the case that kind of machine stamped blades are sort of inferior. So this is kind of just one indication. You can see here this one actually has a stamped kind of mei. So there's quite a marked difference between the styles there. You should be able to tell quite easily. Another thing you should look out for is the back condition. Now this is something that should greatly affect the price of the blade. If you see here between these two blades, or even this one here, if I fit this on, you can see that this has a very clean hollow. Even this cheap one has a relatively clean hollow here, and whereas this one has this huge kind of flats, and here as well there's these flats, and these two blades have what's called a beta ura, which is basically a flat back. Ideally it should be so that these two kind of edges here along the sides, top, they should be very, very thin, to almost non-existent. These are called the ashi. Then they should kind of come round, and there should be a thin kind of line here at the edge. And if this is all kind of uniformly thin, it's what's called an ito ura. Now Keizaburo has, in my opinion, basically the nicest finished backs of any plane now. You can see it's super thin all the way around, nice and even, beautifully finished. This is kind of what you're really aiming for, although very rarely do planes come with such a nice finish on the back. After a lot of use they become like this. That's basically because the guy flattening the back or kind of sharpening or whatever has gone too far and basically just kind of flattened this whole area here as well. That's just a sign of bad kind of maintenance skill on part of the previous owner. Blades like this should be reduced in price accordingly, and as a guide, this, as I said earlier, this Ishido Hyun, new this cost about 30,000 kind of yen, and I bought this blade with die for 15,000, so it's half the price. Um, there's many reasons for that. Obviously, because it's used, there's a lot of kind of filing along going around on here. It's because basically as the plane gets used, the guy adjusting it has been hitting it with a hammer, a metal hammer, mushroomed over the top, and so this is being filed down. This has reduced the price, and obviously the back condition here has reduced the price, and also the length of the steel that's been left over has also reduced the price, and there's obviously the rust and stuff. So all those combine to have reduced this plane blade to half the cost. I mean, this is a perfectly usable blade. When you have a kind of an iron, the chip breaker on here, this kind of hollow does actually make no difference to the planing, and this is only useful for single bladed planes, which I'll probably cover in another video. But there's mainly cosmetic importance, but all these kind of things combine to have reduced this blade by half the price. So if you're looking at a blade, you know, keep that in mind and kind of bid or maybe try to haggle the price down accordingly. Another thing which is kind of interesting is here again, as I said, these two blades are identical in their make. They're made both by the same guy, they have the same kind of brand as it were, but this one's significantly shorter, and because of that length difference, this has been reduced, you know, 5-6 times compared to this. This still has plenty of steel left, so this is a, you know, perfectly good blade to use. Now, also when you're looking at used blades, you'll find a lot of blades which are kind of short like this. Don't kind of dismiss them as being too short to use, because they got this short for a reason, and that's because, well, actually there's two kind of reasons. The most kind of, I guess, common reason, or the one that I would be inclined to believe, would be that because this is a quality blade, the guy using this blade has been using it a lot and sharpening it a lot, and that's why it got so short. If it was a crappy blade, the guy using this wouldn't have even gone to the trouble of using it this much to have, you know, reduced the blade. This is a new blade by comparison. You can see the steel has been reduced by that much. So, you know, the guy using this blade must have deemed that that blade would have been, you know, good enough to have warranted this much use. So if you're looking on auctions and stuff, look for blades which are short but have a decent amount of steel left so you can still use them. They're very likely going to be good blades, which will work well for you. Also in this case, I found this blade and I noted its length, and so I found this blade as well, which had the same name, and this had a longer piece of steel, so I bid on this one too. This is a good indication that, you know, this is a good way to buy things. Find a short blade with name A, but find a better condition one with that same name, and you know, you can be sure, or it'll give you a good indication that it'll be a good blade. So that's another tip there for you to help you buy a blade. And the kind of another thing you want to look at is the kind of edge here, this lamination. I don't know if you can actually see. I'll probably do a close-up and show you that. Now, the other kind of thing you want to look out for in a blade is this lamination line and the backing iron. The lamination line here, this actually doesn't have a lamination line. You can see this is a full tool steel blade. This is what you'd find in the absolute lowest of the low quality blades. So this is no good. You can see there's no line there. Now this is the K-Zaburo blade, and you can see there's very clear thin lamination of steel here to the backing iron. This is kind of what you're looking for. And this is an Ishido here, Teruhide, and you can see it's got a thicker line. And you can see these kind of striations in the backing steel. This is what I was showing you in the kind of backing steel chunk. This is not such a great thing. These striations mean that the steel is it basically has different hardness is, I think, according to Yamamoto-san anyway. But you can see the main thing here is the lamination thickness here on the Keizaburo is way thinner. Well, not way thinner, but it's thinner than the Ishido here. Basically, the thinner the lamination, the better, because there's less hard steel for you to sharpen, so it's easier to sharpen. Old blades usually have a thin lamination, and well, Keizaburo, it seems, he also uses a thin lamination. That's a very good thing. So this is a kind of another sign of a nice blade. Okay, so here's a range of different die in 3 different materials. There's shirakashi, akagashi, and hon akagashi. I'll get to these 2 in a bit, but these are the kind of 3 sort of main materials you'll see used in commercial die. There's basically Japanese white oak, Japanese kind of red oak, and real Japanese red oak, which I'll kind of explain. But by far the most common is this stuff, the shirakashi. This is a relatively newly cut die, so it's kind of quite white. This is a very old vintage one, which I got for an auction. You see it's, I don't know if you'd call this patina, but it's got kind of dirt and sort of, you can see lots of signs of use there. And you can see roughly that a used shirakashi die can actually get sort of dark and, well, kind of reddish, kind of comparable to the akagashi. So it's sort of hard to tell just by color alone between these 3. This piece of hon akagashi is actually an exceptionally dark piece. I haven't seen much pieces which are kind of this dark. They usually are quite a bit paler. But you know, this because it's being wood, it's very variable. You can get dark pieces like this. You can also get pieces almost as white as shirakashi here. So just by color alone, it's hard to tell what species you have. I'll give you the kind of thing that you actually look for when you're trying to distinguish between these woods is the main thing is the pore structure. Basically, akagashi has the largest pores and the kind of the most open grain, and then shirakashi and the hon akagashi. For that reason, akagashi is actually the least desirable of these 3 types of wood. The most desirable being hon akagashi here. This is rarer than the other 2, and this is denser and also more kind of durable. It's not as resilient as shirakashi, as in shirakashi will actually have a bit of give to it, a bit of spring, whereas these 2 are more kind of brittle. The hon akagashi is differentiated from the akagashi in that this is actually the real red oak. Basically, in Japan, akagashi, when it's marked as akagashi, actually refers to a species of kashi, or the kind of the oak, which is actually called ichigashi, and that's this stuff. This is the kind of wood which is used in normally akagashi chisel handles. It's basically the kind of I wouldn't say the worst choice, but the least desirable of these 3, and it's the cheapest by far in price of kind of pricing. Hon akagashi is quite expensive in a die. It has a premium over shirakashi. I don't know by how much exactly, but it is more expensive than the other 2. Shirakashi being about 4,000 yen roughly for a newly cut die. So, you know, ichigashi, I don't know if you can actually even spec ichigashi from a well-known die maker. And I've only rarely seen hon akagashi up for offer, but this is probably available. Apart from these 3 kind of species, the other kind of species of wood you'll see in commercial die is Mikasa ebony. That's more of a wood that's for show. It's very flashy, very nice black with some dark brown striping there, but it's not actually sort of such a great wood, I wouldn't say, for dye, because it's very brittle. The pores on it are also quite large, not huge, depending on the piece you have, but it's basically is quite brittle, so you need to be careful in how you store it. Speaking of which, the most stable or the least crack prone is probably shirakashi. This is the most resilient wood, and it's also less prone to kind of cracking. Akagashi is probably the most prone to cracking, and then followed by maybe Hon Akagashi. So overall, shirakashi is a very, very, very good dye material, considered out of these three. If you have the money and you can find a good dye, then Hon Akagashi is also a very good choice. But I would definitely recommend you look for a nice shirakashi dye. They're very reasonably priced. They have very nice properties in that, you know, they're durable, etc. They're quite stable, and they should be very common. Now, I've seen kind of other dyes from other materials made by their owners. Things from, you know, ranging from purple heart to bubinga, you know, yellow heart, all sorts of different woods. So the wood selection is not really a huge kind of factor, and it shouldn't really determine on, shouldn't really play such a huge role in what plane you buy. Of course, you can cut your own dye, and there's an old saying which basically says you will use up 10 dye for the life of one blade. So they're pretty much kind of disposable things, really. So don't put too much effort into choosing a dye. But if you have the choice, I would personally recommend a good shirakashi dye. Now, I'm going to give you a close-up of these three species kind of a wood, so you can see the pore structure, and maybe if you can actually get your hands on a dye yourself, then you may be able to kind of identify it, hopefully. Okay, so here's a close-up of the kind of the new shirakashi dye. Here's my finger sort of reference scale. You can see there's some pores here, but you can see generally that it's very finely poured. I mean, compared to my finger here, compared to Western oaks, it's very, very fine. The Western oaks I've seen at least have very large pores. This is the side, and this here is the sole. So you can see there's very tight pores. So that's the kind of the fresh sample. This here is the vintage one. You probably can't see very well, so it's so dark. Hang on. There we go. See, this is the vintage one. This is the sole. You know, the pores here are slightly larger, it seems, but still relatively fine. This is the side here. Okay. So that's the vintage shirakashi. Now moving on to ichigashi, which is the kind of the fake stuff. You can see this has pretty large pores. They're very deep. Okay, that's the side. Get this into focus. And this is the sole. You can see there's very large kind of pores. So that's one sample. Here's another sample of ichigashi. This is the side. You can see there some pretty definite pores there. You can see. It's the sole. So see, there's a very marked difference between the two kashis there. So this is the fake stuff. Now this is the Hon Akashi, and this is actually quite dark, so you might not be able to see very well. But this also has pores which are very fine. You can see this is kind of comparable to the shirakashi. So that was the side. and here's the sole. You can see there's not much, well, compared to the akagashi, the fake stuff. There's not really. There's actually a pretty big difference between these two akagashis. Okay, so this is kind of it for the series, but you can see there you go, some pause there. Yeah, it's kind of it for the series. So I hope you've found some information there which you can use if you're scouring the auctions for some kanna, etc. So yeah, hope you enjoyed it, and as I said, I hope to be doing a tuning video sometime soon, so if you're interested, look out for that as well.